Okay, let's jump right in. When we think about biological differences between males and females, health risks, diseases, there's a common idea, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. The assumption is often, well, it's mostly down to our fundamental genetics, right?
The XX versus XY chromosomes, the hormones,
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
exactly. That's, the classic view. Seems logical that your basic sex chromosomes would drive most of the biological variation, including health stuff.
And we definitely see differences. I mean, disease rates, how drugs work differently sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. Those differences are real.
Oh, yeah.
But the why they exist at that deep biological level, that's the really interesting question.
Well, that's what this deep dive is all about. There's this major new international study, really big, that tackled that question head on.
Right. They looked beyond just the genes. It went down to the level of proteins.
Proteins, yeah, the little machines doing the work in our cells.
Yeah.
They wanted to see what's really driving the differences we observe between sexes.
So our mission today is to unpack the sources from this pretty groundbreaking research.
And maybe challenge some long-held beliefs along the way.
Could well be. The findings are. Well, let's get into it.
And you mentioned it was big. Just how big are we talking?
Massive, really. Think data from the UK Biobank and the Finland study.
Okay.
They analyzed something like 6,000 different proteins.
6,000, wow.
Yeah, and linked that to hundreds of diseases across, get this, 56,000 men and women.
Okay, that's some serious scale. That lets you see things you just wouldn't in a smaller study.
Precisely. You get the statistical clout to spot patterns, even subtle ones.
All right, so digging into the findings, what's the first big takeaway?
Well, the first part kind of confirms what you might expect.
Which is?
That protein levels do differ quite a bit between males and females. They found differences in about 2/3 of those 6,000 proteins they measured.
2/3. So, okay, widespread differences at the protein level. That's confirmed.
Confirmed. But, like you said, that wasn't the huge surprise. That's more the baseline observation.
The real question they were after was why, right? Is it mainly those genetic differences?
Right.
The XX versus XY?
Yeah.
Controlling how much of these proteins get made.
Exactly. Are the chromosomes the primary regulators here?
And this is where reading the source material gets really interesting. Unexpected, even.
Definitely. They looked closely at what you could call the genetic switches.
Switches.
Yeah.
Like volume control.
Yeah, kind of like genetic dimmer switches controlled by our genes that dial protein production up or down.
Okay.
And they asked, do these switches work differently depending on whether someone has XX or XY chromosomes?
And the answer was?
This is the kicker. They found that only a tiny fraction, about 100 proteins out of all those thousands.
Only 100?
Roughly, yeah. Only about 100 showed regulation that was actually different based on genetic sex.
Hang on. So even though levels were different for 2/3 of the proteins,
Right.
the genetic instructions for controlling those levels were basically the same for almost all of them, whether XX or XY.
That's exactly what they found. It's a crucial distinction. The result, the protein level, is often different.
But the genetic rule book telling the cell how to regulate it.
Almost identical across the sexes for the vast majority.
Wow. Okay, that feels like the real headline finding from this study then.
It really is.
Because the implication is huge. Most of those observed protein differences between males and females aren't mainly explained by direct XXXY genetic differences.
Correct. Genetics, in this specific context of protein regulation, seems to be a much smaller part of the picture than maybe assumed.
So if it's not mostly genetics,
Yeah.
what is driving these differences? Where do the study authors point?
Well, this is where they really shift the focus. They argue we need to look seriously at other factors.
Factors beyond biology.
Beyond the traditional biological ones, yeah. The source material calls them non-medical factors.
Like what specifically?
Things like where people live and work, their education level.
Okay. Socioeconomic factors?
Exactly. Financial situation, access to resources, healthcare, healthy food, things like that, and also lifestyle choices.
So the study is basically saying, hey, look over here. We need to consider these environmental and social factors much more seriously when we investigate sex differences in health.
That's the strong message, yes. Don't just look at genes and hormones. These other things seem to be playing a really significant role in shaping biology at the protein level.
Which, when you think about it, has enormous implications for medicine, for public health.
Huge. Especially for things like precision medicine and how we develop drugs.
How so?
Well, Professor Claudia Langenberg, one of the authors mentioned in the source, she points out that understanding why populations differ is key for precision medicine.
Right.
If protein levels linked to disease or drug response differ between sexes, we need to know the drivers. Is it genetics or is it these other factors?
And knowing that might change how you target a treatment.
Potentially, yes. Though she also makes an interesting point, the fact that the genetic variants that regulate proteins mostly behave similarly in males and females, that's actually helpful.
How is that helpful?
It means that insights about how a genetic variant affects protein regulation, maybe studied in one group, are likely still valid for the other sex. It simplifies some aspects of genetic research.
But it doesn't explain the different levels we see.
Exactly. And that's where Michael Prulu, the lead author, comes in. She emphasizes the power of looking at genes and proteins together on this scale.
And her point is
That we absolutely need to understand these factors beyond genetics to get to what she calls more tailored and equitable healthcare.
tailored and equitable, meaning accounting for these wider influences.
Precisely. Biology isn't happening in a vacuum. It's interacting constantly with our lives, our environments.
Now, there's an important clarification in the sources about how they defined male and female in this study, isn't there?
Yes, and it's important methodological context. For this specific analysis looking at genetics and proteins, they categorize people based on chromosomal information, XX or XY.
Which they acknowledge doesn't always match up with gender identity.
Correct. They're quite clear about that. They explain it was necessary for the scientific approach here, using large data sets like the UK Biobank, where consistent gender identity data suitable for this type of analysis wasn't available across the board.
So it's just understanding how the biological analysis was framed?
Exactly. It's about the methodology used for this specific scientific question.
Okay. So let's pull all this together. After this deep dive into the research, what's the main takeaway for you?
For me, it's this. Yes, biological differences at the protein level between sexes are real, they're widespread. But this huge study strongly suggests that our basic genetics, the XXXY difference, is actually a surprisingly small factor in causing most of those specific protein level differences.
And instead, the spotlight shifts.
Yeah. It shifts much more onto our environment, our social conditions, our lifestyle. Those non-medical factors seem to be exerting a much stronger influence on these fundamental biological markers than we perhaps appreciated.
Which is critical information, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
If we're serious about understanding health disparities, about developing truly effective and fair healthcare,
We need a broader view.
we absolutely do. We have to look beyond the purely biological, the genes and hormones, and really grapple with how our environment and life experiences shape our biology right down to the molecular level.
So here's something for you, the listener, to chew on. If something as fundamental as protein levels, the actual machinery inside your cells is significantly shaped by things like where you live, or your education, or your job.
What does that really tell us about the root causes of health and illness?
And maybe, just maybe, where the most powerful levers for improving health might actually be found.